Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of This is Crucial. I'm here with my co-host, Amos Disasa from First Pres Dallas, and our amazing guest for today, David Vásquez-Levy, who is a dear friend of First Pres Berkeley and has become a very wonderful colleague and kind and generous friend to me in the recent months of living in the Bay. For those of you who are just joining us, This is Crucial is a conversation, yes, between Amos and I and our guests, but also all of you who are tuning in. So thank you for making this time in your day. We invite you as you listen in to chat in, type in whatever medium you're on, your questions and your comments, so we can fold them into this conversation. And we will try to get to as many as we can, but we can't always guarantee that we can cover the expanse of your curious minds. As Amos and I have ventured down this road with This is Crucial, we've realized that one of the great values that we want to hold in this is just modeling, if that actually almost sounds like too ambitious of a word, but just giving a space to have authentic conversation where we come here with our own experiences and stories, but not here simply to be experts or to educate, but to encourage you all, give you the language and the vocabulary and the compassion to have similar conversations in your own world. We know how hard some of these topics are to engage in, and sometimes we don't do it not because we don't care, but because we don't know what our entry points are. And so hopefully we will illuminate some of those entry points today. Amos?
Yeah, well, I think David, we're going to spend some time getting to know you today, and our focus is on immigration and also on migration. And as you might know, David, Charlene, and I, our origin stories are connected to places outside of this country. And David, we had a chance to talk earlier, and also got to hear some of your story about the route that you took to get here. And I think Charlene and I are going to answer that question as well. What route did you take to get here? But I think to set the scene for us, we're going to begin with you, David, and then if you don't mind, give us some of you give us your background, how in your route of migration. Where did you go, and how long did the journey take?
Thank you. It's great to be with both of you, Amos and Charlene. Thank you for the invitation and the chance to be here on This is Crucial. Greetings to those that I may know from First Press and also here in Berkeley and others as well, as we get to make a new community connection as well with First Press Dallas. So I am David Vásquez-Levy. I serve as president of Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. When I was, a young child growing up in Guatemala, I never really thought, oh, I want to be a seminary president in Berkeley, California. So we never know, journeys and our migration stories are shaped by a wide variety of things. My own was shaped, I would say, as I said, I grew up in Guatemala in Central America. My family was a mix. My last name is Vásquez-Levy, so that captures a bit of that. On the one side was my dad's side of the family, which has long roots and histories in Guatemala from some early migrations, probably in the early period of colonization of Central America by Spain. And so there's part of my family that came from migration from that area, Spain, and then a large part of it from Guatemala as well, native communities. A few years ago, I did a DNA test just to sort of figure out what of my own story was that you grow up with certain stories to try to figure out what's really real, right? And found this sort of mix that echoed much of what I grew up with. So the largest part of my DNA is actually Jewish. My family background is also migration way early on from Jewish communities that were displaced at different periods. And so my mom's side of the family is Jewish, and I grew up in that community in Guatemala. And that part of the family came from a little bit of Eastern Europe and somewhat in Alsace-Lorraine, ended up in Guatemala in the early 1900s. Out of forced migrations from persecution of Jews, but also economic opportunities. So my great-grandfathers, both of them ended up in Guatemala out of that experience. And then I grew up, my grandmother, my mother grew up in Guatemala. The other largest part of my DNA is a native Guatemalan, and that's a connection with the roots of my dad's side of the family. And I came to the US right after high school, in part because of a desire to pursue theological education. I came to grew up in Guatemala in the middle of a civil conflict, a civil war. That was many folks probably on the call familiar with the story of civil conflict in Central America, which was really sort of a proxy conflict between communism ideas and capitalism, that got played out in that region. And but I saw in the church communities that were connected across all kinds of issues of faith, conviction, but also organizing politically and socially. And so I came to the US with that desire to pursue theological education out of the tradition I grew up in as well. So I grew up Jewish, but also my dad's side of the family was Lutheran. And ended up in Texas for part of the time. I did my undergraduate degree there. Once I got here, I realized I needed to go to college, should probably learn English. I didn't grow up speaking English. And then eventually ended up going to school in Chicago for seminary. So anyway, a lot of mobility in my family, my own life, both in my history and into my own family. And then the makeup of my own family is as we all got to connect a little bit earlier between the three of us, but my family is an immigrant family in many ways. We joke that we are connected by both love and coffee. So my children are originally from Ethiopia, where coffee is originally from. I'm from Guatemala, which I'll arguably say is the best coffee in the world. And my wife's family is Finnish, and Finns drink the most coffee in the world. So I would say migration is throughout, is both what I'm committed to, life experience, and I see it in many ways as what it means to be human, to be a person of the move. So we'll talk more about that today. But great to share a bit of that story.
Thank you, David. I heard echoes of my story in your story as you were sharing it. One of those echoes that I heard was the role that the conflicts between superpowers played out in very remote regions and places in the world. Where I'm from, Ethiopia, late 1970s. You had the global superpowers, Soviet Union and the U.S. were also in a proxy war there as well. The communists were supporting the Derg regime in Ethiopia, who were trying to overthrow the imperialists, Haile Selassie, and they managed to assassinate the king. At that point, it's the oldest monarchy in the entire world, right? And it ended there in the mid 1970s, and then the U.S. was supporting the imperialists and hoped to, because of the stability that monarchy represented. But the communists were empowered by the weapons and the money that was being given to them. And still to this day, even in Ethiopia, forced migration is present. I mean, my family immigrated here in the early 1980s, mainly to escape the terror of the Marxist regime there, primarily because my father was educated here in the West. And was a Christian that was educated, right? The most dangerous kind of citizen in Ethiopia if you're a Marxist. And so yeah, we had to get out and then come here to the U.S. In the 1970s. He also came here to get his education, finish his schooling as well. But even now, back in Ethiopia, there's another conflict that's being waged, as it is in many parts of Africa and also in South America, where the Chinese are building out, their network. They are supporting poor countries that are in developing countries that need help with infrastructure, for instance, right? And so the Chinese government is giving them loans, giving us in Ethiopia loans. We just built the first intercontinental railroad in Africa, from the capital of Addis Ababa all the way to Djibouti, to get to the to get to the port there, right off the Horn of Africa. So, and that was done because the Chinese loaned us money. So even today, when you go to Ethiopia, you land at Bole International Airport, you walk through that airport, almost all the international travelers are from China. So there's 2 international flights daily, right? From, of all places, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia to Beijing. 2 nonstop international flights, and they're full, every single one of them, right? So how that struggle there that's being played out in the Horn of Africa right now for influence in Ethiopia is affecting the livelihoods of people there. I think it's like it's unsettled as to what the decisions of these 2 countries, right, and how they're being manifested in other places will affect people that live there. So that's where I'm from.
You migrated from Ethiopia
Yeah,
to South Carolina,
South Carolina, right, yeah. So
from by way of South Carolina to straight to
Dallas.
Dallas.
I mean, I've been around the block, I mean, I've been a few places. I've been to Brazil, spent some time there, and spent some time in North Carolina, and now I'm in Dallas, the first time really that I've lived east of the Mississippi River or west of the Mississippi River. So in some ways it's very familiar here in Dallas. That it feels much like a southern city, and in other ways it feels like I'm very far west. It feels like a western city. So Dallas is just kind of in between 2 places. So, but yeah, this is a very metropolitan city here that we live in. I mean, not metropolitan, cosmopolitan city. It seems like the entire world is represented here in Dallas. And it's the first time I've lived in a place like that, where there are 10 Ethiopian restaurants I can go to, which is different, than South Carolina.
Berkeley has its share of Ethiopian restaurants. On my drive to work, I drive by several flourishing Ethiopian restaurants, so you can get some good Ethiopian cuisine here as well, Amos. My story is different than both of yours in that I was born in the United States. I was born in Walnut Creek, California, on the West Coast. But my parents immigrated here. I actually texted my mom beforehand to double check. My father immigrated here in 1964 for school. So, like you, David. And then my mom immigrated here in 1972 for a medical residency. For them, they were not fleeing anything. They have the immigrant story of seizing opportunity that they saw very much so in the US, and met here in the States. So both obviously from Korea, met here in the States, had 3 daughters who don't speak very much Korean. Our native tongue is English. We all now live in California, New York, and Virginia, so across the country. So my migration narrative includes California to New York, New Jersey, back to California. So very coastal states, not much variation of living in different places, always kind of living near an urban center where the diversity that both of you have described has been very much common to what I've understood the United States of America to be. If anything, I'm probably more fluent in Spanish. I took that more years in school than I took Korean, even though I studied abroad in Korea. But yeah, this is home for me. And despite the fact that I often get asked, no, but where are you from? Right? I say, well, I'm from California. My parents were born in Korea, but I am a second generation Korean American. And so immigration, migration, this traversing of boundaries, exactly like you said, David, is a part of our human DNA to be a journeying people. And obviously, this has become a part of the political conversation with recent elections. And this is very much a part of the theme of these conversations is really what happens when we other people, when we isolate people, when we demonize people in an othering sense. And we've seen that happen in the US around immigrants. And the question is, well, aren't we all immigrants? So how is this even an issue? And so in your line of work, David, you explore migration narratives in scripture, and obviously you have traveled the world. You were just telling us about time you've spent in Israel and Palestine. Um, that so often we create borders and walls. And so and, and look where we are right now, right? So how are you kind of just processing and taking in the last, say, few years of our current discourse around immigration?
Yeah, well, I think, the first thing I would say is I think it's critical for this type of conversation to happen within our faith communities. I think churches have a critically important role to play in how we think about the othering of people and the sense of ourselves, and holistically to think about humanity and all of us as children of God, as beloved by God. And that the challenge I think we face as faith communities is to ensure that those discussions are grounded in scripture, grounded in our traditions, and not only in political discourse that can be quite divisive. So they need to engage that political discourse, but not only be grounded in it. So that if we think about the role of sacred texts, the vast majority of biblical stories are all about migrations. Human migration is a core story in human life. So you think about whether it's the very story of creation and then the first couple, however you think of those creation stories, there's a displacement that happens out of a conflict of the desire for knowledge, the opportunity. Humans follow trade. People either follow or pursue what we describe between even our own story, either persecution. People are either, kind of a pull or a push of migration. So they're either escaping something or being attracted by something. That's the driving story within the scriptures throughout all of it. And what that points to is that the conversations about migration and human mobility are a human story. They're throughout all of our stories. And so it isn't something strange, bizarre, new. There is a heightened level of encounter across difference that's happening because of a number of different things. A much more integrated economic system, a lot more facility to move just by the creation of vehicles or transportation. Amos was talking about the trading, right? You build a train from Addis Ababa to Djibouti, you're going to have a massive shift that's going to have a major impact on the mobility of people and product. In a country like Ethiopia that has been landlocked, to all of a sudden have access to water, right? Which then connects it to much more trading. The more we trade, the more we migrate and move. So we are certainly at a time in human history of a heightened level of mobility and migration, and a lot more encounters, the kind of restaurants we see everywhere of all kinds of ethnic communities that are an expression of that. So we're at a heightened level of it. But this isn't new. Humans have always wrestled with this question about mobility and migration. Something happens to us as humans when we are on the move, when we are dislocated from what is familiar, from our networks, from our communities in which we are perhaps more open to the divine. So biblical texts are often about mobility, often about migration. You take every biblical story that you want to think about, from, again, Adam and Eve and being displaced out of the garden, right? And finding their way east of Eden. And then you trace that through the search for the promised land. You have the calling of Abraham and Sarah, or then the displacement of people in Egypt and slavery and their escape from that into a new promised land, or the formation of the nation of Israel and its displacement into exile and return from that. So it's a constant story that is happening throughout. So something happens when we are on the move that opens us up to the divine. A similar thing is happening. It's not only within the Christian tradition. We could also say that about sacred texts of other traditions, but to stay within our communities, the Christian community, the same thing is happening today. Folks, as they migrate, the very first thing that they will do is set up faith communities. They as much of our Christian communities in the United States are being enlivened growth is happening primarily through immigrant communities that are coming. And the first thing they do when they have no access to other ability to establish themselves, they begin to establish faith communities. The person who is a dishwasher on Thursday is a pastor on Sunday, right? That's where their opportunity for leadership and development is at. So I would say, for me, as I think about this, this is a really incredible time. I mean, there is a lot of mobility. Much of that can be viewed as conflict, but there's also a lot of opportunity. And I think the church has both an opportunity to engage this conversation, but also a lot of resources to draw from to think differently about how we engage those who are, coming from other communities and ourselves, and to see ourselves in them.
Yeah. I want to return to this theme that you just brought up about how our biblical narratives, right, are often about displacement of movement, either being pushed or pulled towards something or somewhere. And I want to set that right up beside our some of the fear and misconceptions we have about strangers, sojourners, travelers. There is in the consciousness of our country, and in other places as well, as consciousness of humanity, right? Period. There is this myth that I think we all hold about the stranger, the traveler, the person who recently left from somewhere to come to where we are, where we're standing right now, and that is that person is running away from something, that person is dangerous because they have a secret, that they have not yet revealed about what they left behind and why they left. And while I think I stand here and I say, wow, that is a myth that we hold, the myth of the foreigner being dangerous, all right, because of something that they're not revealing to us about where they came from. But then I open up the Bible and I'm like, well, this myth is all over the Bible as well, right? I mean, the foreigner is dangerous, and the foreigner or the stranger in the homeland is often not in their own homeland because of something they did. Sin was the reason, right? That they were cast out or banished from the place where they're supposed to call home. And you look at, as you said, the story of the Garden of Eden. Adam was the first person, first person to actually have to be forced to migrate, told to leave the garden, right? Not able to till, and had to move immediately because of something that he did. And those stories, of course, are scattered throughout the Hebrew Bible. So help me out here.
Well, I think that's really important in dealing with Scripture. I think any part of what we got to do some work, right? We got to engage Scripture with their complexity. They're not monolithic, right? It's not one theme sung throughout the entire Scriptures. There's actually quite a bit of what we would call xenophobia within the Scriptures. A lot of rhetoric that is afraid of the foreigner, sees it as problematic. You look at the books of the book of Nehemiah and Ezra. These are two really small books that are not often familiar to folks, but they're texts that in the period of the exile, so when people were returning from exile, coming back into the land, there was a lot of fear of the foreigners. The sense was that while people were in exile, they married foreign individuals, and in a way there wasn't a purity of the nation, and that was part of the punishment. That was part of the reason for their wrongdoing. And now as they return, they're actually directed to divorce their foreign wives. It's usually the way that the theme of those texts is identified. So there is throughout the text, I think, this tension about how to receive or not receive those who are strangers, how to make them part of the community or not. Will our association with the foreigner lead us away from our gods, right? That's a lot of the way that the text is portrayed. And wrestling with this idea of sin and what motivated somebody's displacement, right? Is it a punishment? And are we to really associate with those who, have been cast out, and what, will we bear the consequences of their wrongdoing? And I think that the text also lives in that tension between that fear of the stranger, the other, what it might lead us astray, so to speak, and this call for embracing and recognizing ourselves in the other. Those two strands come into real, I think, sharp view in the question that is asked of Jesus about what must I do to inherit eternal life? Well, love God and your neighbor. And then the question becomes, well, who's my neighbor? Right. And the way the text introduces that encounter between Jesus and this person who's trying to ask the question which we are wrestling with, who is my neighbor? Right. That's the question of the immigrant. Who am I to have relationship with, have responsibility for? And what Jesus does in that is to flip it, right? So the desire of the one asking the question who's trying to justify himself, is the way the text says it. It's easy for us to think, oh, here's this guy who doesn't really want to do what he's called to do to care for the other. The question of who is my neighbor fills some of the largest, most extensive legal codes in human history. The US legal code for immigration is as complex and as extensive as our tax law. It is incredible. And that's all it's answering, is a question of saying, who is my neighbor? Who has the right to be in our community? What are the conditions under which we will accept them? What are the consequences of their past and what they have done into whether we will accept them or not? So the first thing I want to say is it is important to recognize that this is complex, right? And that any sort of simplistic understanding of both migration or incorporation of others, any idealization of the immigrant and the other is not going to be helpful to our conversation. Neither will it be to demonize the other. And so what the sacred text does is put this tension between the care for the community and its well-being and the recognition of brokenness, sometimes at the core of displacement and migration, but also the call to embrace each other as humans in that tension.
When we ask who is my neighbor, I sometimes imagine that what I'm really asking is, who am I? Because the way we answer that question, right? Mm-hmm. Who is my neighbor really reflects on who we are. It's a question of identity of ourselves, right? As much as it is a question of someone else's identity.
Completely. That's really insightful, right? So it's this idea that, I often think, things are not necessarily in binaries of this or that, but they're often in some kind of a spectrum. One of the spectrums around this is, we identify our sense of boundaries of self-identity, community, either by belief, certain boundaries, certain walls, right? Communities are trying to say, who are we? And beyond that is the other, right? And so at different periods of time, we have experienced a big shift in the United States between the previous administration and the current administration to try to identify how we define those boundaries. But globally, as the world has become much more integrated by all these movements, our own experience of the three of us, of our families, of ourselves migrating, the reality is that while human mobility has increased significantly because of trading, because of ability to move and all these things, at the same time, there's been a heightened growth in this desire to set boundaries. I'll give you one example. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, the Berlin Wall in many Western ideologies represented these boundary, this lack of freedom, right? You can't move beyond this area, and people are getting, sort of limited by communism. And it was the boundary we've already talked about between capitalism and communism, right? When the wall came down in 1989, there were a total of 17 walls in the world that divided nation states, physical walls dividing nation states. Today, there are 77 of them. Wow. So in a period that many of us have perceived between 1989, this period of openness and mobility and growth, the reality is that at this moment, these questions of identity are being raised by many nations, right? They're becoming, the conflict right now in Ethiopia, for example, is a conflict of identity. Who is this particular community? The Tigrinya group is trying to identify their own identity and the desire to create their own boundaries and their own self-agency and identification, right? And this is happening globally. So some of these movements of saying, who am I? So then going back to the role of faith communities, I am a child of God. I'm not defined by a particular ethnic identity. So this is a much more broad identity that can help us to be able to see ourselves more fully as human to each other and be able to see these various particularities of our ethnic and racial and historical and legacies as valuable and enriching, but not necessarily as a definition that is so narrow that it creates this boundary. Humans desire a way of identity. So can we identify ourselves not necessarily against the other, against something, but can we identify ourselves around a more common sense of humanity?
So this statistic you just gave around walls is kind of blowing my mind, right? Because yes, the kind of common cultural idea is diversity. Like we're now the melting pot and all of this stuff, and yet you're saying in that culture, we're actually hunkering down a bit more, right? And then you're also saying, which I totally agree, our identity is as children of God. And yet we're also in this movement where we're naming particularity, right? Like I am a child of God, but I also have a unique story as an Asian American woman, as a Korean American woman. So it's like, it is so much tension, just as you named in scripture. It's this tension of caring for the community and also, welcoming it, all of the things. So one of the things that we've tried to unpack here is the fears that undergird violent choices, racial violence, racial inequity, all of these things. For putting up more walls, what do you think what kind of fear is that naming that we're going to our identity is going to disappear?
Yeah, well, so I think that's part of it, right? There's a fear that these people are not like we are. Look at the story of the book of Ruth. The fear of the book of Ruth and the book of Ruth in the Bible. It's a very short book, about 4 chapters. It's often viewed together with the book of Esther, both stories of women, as counter narratives to the other 2 books I mentioned earlier, of Ezra and Nehemiah. So Ezra and Nehemiah are 2 leading figures, right? They're sort of officially powerful people. They're that are trying to articulate the nation and its purity and its identity out of exile, that they will be best defined by sort of hunkering down on what was, right? There's sort of like the desire to go back to a period prior to the exile in which things, in the imagination of those individuals, this is what it was. I think you can pick up the themes of this going on in our own political spheres, right? And so this desire to return to a period of that. Ruth and Esther are much more complex stories, right? The perception is these women don't know the story, they don't know. So Ruth in particular is a foreigner, and so there is a fear that she's not going to know the rules. She's going to deviate from the traditions of the community, and she's going to drive people away. In fact, the word in Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible text, for foreign woman is the exact same word that is used for prostitute. So the idea is that this is what will lead you away from God, from yourself, from who you are. So there's a threat that you will be watered down, and that, if you watch the 1960s movie Who's Coming to Dinner, I mean, it's sort of like this very crass encounter where a white woman is bringing an African American man into the household for the first time, and it plays on these themes of the idea of a fear that our identity will be watered down, destroyed, our values will be challenged by these communities. So then the antidote that happens in, if you will, antidote, I don't know if that's the right word, but in Ruth, is you get to know this woman. So the book is a book of complete reversals. It starts out in famine, in fear, in displacement politically, so that leads to a movement of migration. And the book ends in a complete reversal of that. It ends in a period of harvest and the birth of a child. And this woman who was the foreigner, who was the one to be feared, in the end becomes integrated in the story as the grandmother of King David, right? There's a phrase that's used in the text that's really powerful, where the women at the beginning of the story who see this as the experience of displacement that Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi has had, saying you basically have sort of, your life has been lost. She calls herself, don't call me even Naomi anymore, which means joyful, but call me Mara, which is bitter. But anyway, that's what's happening at the beginning. By the end of the book, they say this phrase, she, talking about Ruth, this foreign woman, who's constantly called the Moabite throughout the book, right? Mm-hmm. To remind people, this is a foreign woman. At the end, what the women say to Ruth, to Naomi, is, she is better to you than 7 sons. Now, to our ears, it's hard to understand that, but we're talking male versus female. There's lots going on in that text in the story that is basically saying, if you take the time to actually engage people, to get to know who they are, that threat that they represent can actually, there is a way in which they become integrated into who we are, that our best well-being is bound up in caring for those who are different from us, and not just caring for them, but in realizing that our own best future is tied to theirs, which is, I think, part of this, challenging some of the fear that we have as a nation, certainly in the United States, around immigrants, is can we see the people who are coming as as our very future, our very viable future? And we can talk more about that. I think there's some very practical ways to change, not just sort of ideological ways of thinking about this, but very practical ways to think about how immigrants are actually going to be central to the well-being of this nation and to its future as they have been in the past.
Do you think, yes, can't wait to talk about that, first of all. Do you think the fear in the US right now is around dilution of American culture? Because the soundbite I keep on hearing is they, the other, are taking our jobs. It's a scarcity, limited resource thing. There's only so much. I mean, even there's a big question. Why is there an uptick against violence against Asian Americans? Is it because of rhetoric around COVID and that coming from China? And that being obviously a threat, an existential threat, but it precedes that. And it is this whole notion of you're taking our jobs type of a soundbite. And maybe that's not accurate, but
Mhm. Well, so I'll joke about something first, right? There's an artist, Mexican artist, who did a series of pictures in which she identified immigrants as superheroes. And what she does is she did this in New York, and she went around and she took pictures of undocumented immigrants. And she said, these are our superheroes. She was playing a little bit after, or think exploring the theme of superheroes after 9/11. Who are the superheroes, right? And the reason she picked up on this theme as an artist is because she said, here are these people who somehow manage at the same time, amazingly enough, to take our jobs and to be lazy, right? How can you do this, right? How can you do both? How can you be a threat to our industrious production and at the same time be lazy and want to take advantage of the system, right? I mean, these things don't make sense. So she plays with that, and she has, she has pictures of a nanny who holds 3 jobs, provides money for her family back in Mexico, dressed in Superwoman outfit, right? And she has pictures of this. She's got this guy who's a window washer in New York as an immigrant and provides, for his family and is going to school, and he has him dressed in, in like Spider-Man outfit. So those are really phenomenal images of trying to say. But so the first thing to say is there are certainly rhetoric and narratives that have been around for a long time. When you read the book of Ruth, you clearly see that there is a perception of the same thing, that she's going to take advantage of the people. That there's limited resources she's going to abuse and expand, right? And the reality is that most of these individuals, so some of these are sort of the fear mongering that does happen, right? And we have to call that for what it is. There is no evidence in most economic analysis of any society. Migration is essential to the financial well-being of institutions. We have to be very mindful of what you're pointing out right now, because I think that as we come out of a pandemic and there is a large displacement of people generally and a fear that we don't have a lot of resources, we are prone. And I think right now, I think in some ways we're losing this narrative vision, right? We're looking at immigrants coming to the border, not really in huge number. I mean, there's significant numbers, but they're nothing that can overwhelm our systems whatsoever if we tend to them properly. But we are losing the narrative because we are beginning to see this as a threat to our economic well-being, to our longevity, to our ability to survive. The reality is we have created fairly complex economic systems, whether it's production or labor, that are quite elaborate and complex and have the ability to really sort of move around. What migration does, it has throughout history, is allowed for a safety valve of movement. Immigrants are much more entrepreneurial. They move a lot more willingly. Their infrastructure and connections are much more pliable. And so, in economic challenging moments, immigrants tend to be much more generative in what they will just do to make a living, how generative and creative they will get, and how much more willing they are to move. So, what will be really interesting, we're living through, in many ways, an unprecedented time. The pandemic, combined with our ability to work remotely, is actually creating an internal migration within the United States that we have not experienced since probably the Industrial Revolution. And I think we don't quite understand. The church is wrestling with this. What do I do with all, half my church members are actually moving and now zooming into Berkeley from Portland and Las Vegas or whatever, right? So we need to be attentive to this and think, how are we going to shape community differently in a period of massive migration? Because people will be moving. Now, what I love about the book of Ruth, there's many things I love about it, but one of them is that when it begins, it is Naomi who is displaced. So it's the people of Israel who are facing a crisis of famine and a crisis of political crisis. And so they go to Moab, which is a horrible place to go. Nobody should go to Moab. And then at the end, they come back with the Moabite woman. What the book is doing is first, we, whatever the we is, are the ones who are the immigrants. And then we're watching to see how we are treated in this foreign land. But then it flips it, right? And then the foreigner is coming back to us. How are we going to be dealt with? Right. And the reason I'm saying this is, how do we want our kids? My kid is about to head off to DC. How do I want him to be treated? As an immigrant from California going to DC, right? How do I want others to receive this other that's coming into a new community? Right. Because that's the way that they will be. That's what Jesus does in asking the question about who is my neighbor. How did you treat the one who is a stranger? So the neighbor is not just the person who's next to me with whom I share an identity or a religious tradition, but it's the one I opt to care for and to make my relationship with. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I think that this is where the religious communities will need to think about. So what are we going to do about those who come to us externally from other places, recognizing that many of us, our own communities, will also be on the move, particularly as we enter a period of massive displacement, I think, of humans, both because of economic, environment, lots of other forces that I think will create more migration and mobility. Mm.
You mentioned the complexity, of migration, and I think I've heard you say that a few times, right? It's important that we not simplify things here. I was thinking about when I first moved here to Dallas 2 years ago. I came by myself at first, and so lived here by myself for a few months before my family came. One of the first things I did was find an Ethiopian restaurant, right, that I could go to. And I found it's down on close to North Park. It's called Bubba's Foods, and it's this just hole in the wall. It looks like you could buy your lottery ticket from there. It's like an Ethiopian Stop and Shop, so they just sell. It's basically all the things that Ethiopians would want. Ethiopians living in America would want. That's what the store's like. So. And then they sell injera and what also. And so I go in there, I sit down, I walk in, and I recognized the smells, the odors, like the thing. And I saw all the masob, and I saw the bokolo, and I was like, oh, I'm home. This all feels right. It feels good. It was really simple in that moment. Like my body was activated. And then I went up to the counter, and the auntie that was there at the counter, she looks at me and she starts speaking in Amharic to me. I mean, she recognized my face, and she's like, "Oh, I know who you are. You're an Ethiopian, so I'm going to go ahead and start speaking in Amharic to you." I don't know Amharic. I know Oromo, like our native tongue, but I don't know the national language. I mean, I did at one point. in that moment when she asked me in Amharic, do you speak Amharic? And she started talking to me, excited to see me, and I couldn't understand a word she was saying. And although we were from the same place and we shared all the thing, like we shared all the everything that store represented, we shared that in common. I felt like a foreigner and a stranger in that store on that day, even though I went there, to experience something familiar and to be with like my people. That I've yet to experience such an acute sense of otherness and also shame because I didn't know something I should, because I felt like an imposter in that moment, So that's it. And I'm also new to Dallas, right? And so I went to the one place in Dallas that I thought I wouldn't feel so foreign in, and then ended up feeling more foreign inside that store than I had outside, just in Dallas proper. I share all that story with you just to reinforce what you said earlier, David.
Well, I appreciate that very much.
All the different ways in which we are both foreigner and native at the same time, in the same moment sometimes,
Yeah. Well, and I think, and sometimes those places where we expect to be welcomed and be more at home is where that rejection, or either self-imposed or externally, feels the strongest. And I think all of us who are kind of in between, and I think about the millions of people, in the United States who share that experience of in betweenness. Oftentimes you do feel like you're right in the middle of it, and so you feel even more displaced. I think of that African American song. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. And that's a song of displacement. It's a song of migration. It's a song of feeling like what does it mean to feel so rootedless. And what's powerful about scriptures, you think about one of the dominant images of faith in the Bible is in Hebrews 11, right? It's this Oscars of the faith. You have this litany of who are the people of faith, and it goes through each of these, everybody who was a standard of faith. We begin with this the definition of faith as that which we cannot see and we can only hope for, right? And every example that is given ends with this phrase of saying, but they did not reach what they longed for. And then towards the end of this litany of names of people in Hebrews 11, it goes to saying, identifying a person of faith as somebody who's displaced, who knows who their home is not here, but in a city whose architect is God. So part of it is even that experience of displacement you had at that grocery store, in a way, is an experience of faith, of the knowledge that our home and our place is ultimately only in God, right? And that at all times we do, even in the places we feel most at home at, most comfortable in. Think about our struggle to raise children. My gosh, if you have teenagers, right? All of a sudden, this child grew up in your home with your food, with everything you provided. And at some point, the disorientation is that they don't feel they belong. They're trying to figure out, and part of the process they're trying to do is to self-identify away from that. And how much more conflict can you have than a parent with a teenager sometimes, right? But it's like, talk about a place where we don't feel right, even in the place where we should feel most at home. So what I'm saying is that complexity is part of a human experience, right? Of that place of displacement, even within the things that we are most familiar with. Now, while I say this is complex and difficult and, interesting, it's not necessarily something we cannot manage. Humans are incredibly capable of complexity. The economic systems we have created, the trading systems we have created that allow us to produce products in some amazing ways, from pieces from all over the planet into products that we assemble. The creativity of our arts and of our sciences are remarkable. Well, we similarly can approach questions of migration with a similar level of complexity and creativity. I do think that without needing to become just very simplistic about migration, that we can continue to develop as humans the capacity to do this. And what I think is valuable in the sacred stories of migration is that they provide for that level of complexity, right? Not every immigrant in the sacred text is somebody that benefits their community. There are issues. Some of them, as you said, Amos, at the beginning, have escaped from certain things or have done things that have brought them to where they're at. There's reconciliation that needs to take place. There's challenging that needs to happen, right? So part of it is finding what are the stories and to see ourselves in those same things, right? Because the reality is that we are equally complex ourselves in our own setting, in our own family, in our own communities. So how can we see ourselves reflected in that other rather than just simply create this simplistic boundary of nation, of identity, or of language, of culture that then divides us?
I love I love how you're universalizing the concepts of the the immigrant experience, if you will. Um, I mean, I love it. And on the one hand, it is something that we were just talking about this, like, or Amos and I were talking about how Pringles for him was such a delicacy growing up. And I remember same thing, name brand snacks, such a delicacy. My parents would not have splurged on that kind of a thing. Just these like very particular, beautiful things that we get to just kind of hold on to for the immigrant experience. And yet to universalize this notion of movement and displacement. I'm even talking about the relationship between a parent and a teenager, and um it makes it sacred and holy. And Amos, I really do relate to that experience that you had in that grocery store. When I studied abroad in Korea, I got yelled at constantly on the street for not speaking Korean. By It was always the elderly who would not, I mean, not like not a mild scold. I would get yelled at. You are in Korea. You are Korean. Speak Korean. And I was like, I don't speak Korean, right? And so it is this liminal space of not of feeling like you're not enough of what, I mean, and this is truly, I think, a part of the immigrant thing is you're not American enough. And you're also now not Ethiopian enough, Guatemalan enough, Korean enough, right? You're you're trying to become more of something to fit in. I mean, that's why I don't speak Korean, is because my parents wanted me to assimilate. And so
Right.
they spoke to me in English.
Wow. Yeah, it's like your in-betweenness can be, a superpower at times because it allows you to shape shift as necessary to meet the context that you're in. It's like you know how to make yourself enough of something to fit in wherever you are, but you're only kind of there, you're not all the way in. And you're, I don't know, I'm always self-aware of it, to some degree. But I don't know if this is really as much a question of whether you're an immigrant or not, as it is just, I think this is part of the human condition. It's how we all feel. Like it's we all feel sort of
Yeah.
in between places, and
Enough.
yeah, yeah. I just
And I think one of the, if you start thinking about what the pathways we take towards anything, right, it is finding what is the next step I may take around this conversation of migration without getting so overwhelmed by its complexity, by its legality, by its expectations. The first place is, again, to be able, I think, to see ourselves in these stories. So we've identified specific in-betweenness realities, right, that can be very disorienting. um, well, that's very much of a human experience, right? Again, going back to teenagers, part of what teenagers are wrestling with is that even within the communities they're supposed to belong to, they're often trying to feel like they don't belong, right? They're having these moments of disorientation because there is a particularity about who every single individual is. And then this communal, whether it's the popular group or whatever group I'm going to be a part of, is this tension between the particularity and the universality of being human. So the first place is to recognize that there is both something in our own experience that can help us understand the experience of the other, the moments we have felt displaced or not recognized. But also both, as you mentioned, that there is a superpower in that, right? That there's an ability and a strength in being able to be aware of the fact that there isn't a universality in of imposing a particular way of seeing the world on everybody else. So there is actually a value in being able to see the world that way, a little bit askewed, right? And that kind of vision, while sometimes is a burden, can also be a gift, right? And how do we learn to live with that gift? In the conversation the three of us had previously in planning for today, I mentioned how critical it is to recognize even the sacred text references that we often go to about migration or the other. We tend to coalesce around this commandments around the stranger, which are really important, right? It was one of the most repeated commandments in the scriptures is to recognize the stranger and to welcome the stranger. It is motivated by the fact that the people of Israel themselves were strangers, right? There's that you were a stranger in Egypt, therefore you ought to treat others this way. But that's not the extent of the only way in which scriptures guide our understanding and engagement with the other and with the immigrant. It's much more complex than that. And sometimes we actually, I think it is critical that we move beyond that to recognize not just the strangeness of the other, but actually the similarity and the alignment we have with the other. This strangers, I shared earlier in our conversation some statistics around we can't really talk about immigration as strangers in the United States. Here we are, the three of us are immigrants in one way or another, either one or directly or one generation removed, and we are leading the institutions of our communities.
Right.
We have come into this moments of leadership by a number of different things, the callings that we have and the gifts that we have been given and the opportunities and challenges we are facing. But we're not strangers to our communities, right? We have been at this for quite some time to be able to get to the positions and to engage the communities we're engaging. Similarly, most communities, the statistic I share with all of you is like, we're in 2 states that are predominant, that are largely immigrants, most, the significantly large immigrant populations and immigrant descendants. In California, the statistics I shared with you previously is that half of children in California, 18 and under, have an immigrant parent. Half the children. That statistics for Texas is close to about a third of all children in Texas have an immigrant parent. And so these are not strangers, right? And you think about the folks who have been, they are our children's classmates, and they're in their communities, they're in our churches, they're in our employee networks, they are in our communities providing vital services to us in a wide variety of ways. So we need more language than just the welcoming of the stranger. So the welcoming of the stranger is powerful and essential and important. The risk is that it keeps the other as a stranger, and it keeps us in the position of being the ones who have something to give. And then it lends itself to this fear of there isn't enough, so then I can't give to the stranger, right? Rather than some much more symbiotic relationship
Yeah.
that recognizes our codependence with each other, that the world will thrive, and you can take a number of different industries that are going to be vital for us to have a significantly greater degree of migration as a nation in order to be able to really thrive. My father-in-law just passed away about a year ago. All of his care providers at the end of his life were immigrant workers, all of them. There wasn't a single US born provider. And this was in northern Minnesota. This was not in California or Texas, right?
Right.
A small area, small community in northern Minnesota. The aging of the US population will require a massive number of people to care. And we don't have solutions right now.
Right.
We are, we might face it right now because if we have an elderly parent or we ourselves are reaching that age, we're looking at how much it's going to cost to per month to have somebody provided the necessary care. And so then that seems like a crisis. Well, is there a collaborative way of thinking about our well-being and the well-being of emerging communities that see that as a potential way in which we provide for one another, right? Opportunity and employment and work, healthcare, and the same thing in many other fields. I'm using that as one example. I don't want to necessarily reduce the opportunities for immigrants or their contributions to particular areas, but there are a lot of them in which that's going to be really necessary. So the question is, can we think differently about this? Not as this oppositional threat, kind of zero-sum game, but some ways of thinking about this that are much more collaborative.
This is giving me, I mean, to be honest, I was not expecting the conversation to go in this direction. So many of our conversations to this point, Amos and I have been responding to some pretty tough um, situations. Our first conversation, we responded to the shooting in Atlanta, the second, to the Derek Chauvin trial. And, we're both situated in states that immigration is not just a story you read about on the news, and it's not just a political talking point. It is a part of our communities. It's a part of our stories, our individual stories. And so I think it is interesting, David, especially of you talking about what does it mean for us who bear the perspectives and stories and experiences of immigrants to be leading organizations right now? What unique kind of outlook, superpower, I'm going to still use that word, if you will. Um, and so I really am just so appreciative of the way that you have framed the way we can approach this conversation. And yes, to change the, I think that we've, as Christians, have loved welcome the stranger, because it is a beautiful platitude, but then it only gets us so far because it keeps the stranger the stranger. And so the next step being folding this ecosystem, right? And not this transaction of goods and services. Okay, so you kind of, I think that you had just answered this in that question, but maybe if you wanted to add to it, you had said earlier on, David, that I want to go back to how, and this is our final question for the night. Um, Essentially, how immigrants are going to change the world is basically how I got what you wanted to say. And so, any parting words or wisdom in terms of what you're seeing on the horizon with your very prophetic outlook?
Well, I think uh, the increased mobility of people is inevitable, right? Part of it is a question about how will we envision that reality, to do some intentional projections of what will be possible and happen. We're seeing continued shifts in people's ability to move. I'm experiencing it in my own institution, folks working remotely from various places because of the cost of living, relocating because of family, yet being able to maintain their employment across states. So that's one form of migration that will continue to happen, right? So what are the opportunities that technology can afford us to create a sense of that? Our faith communities are being shifted and changed by this migration and mobility. While migration has normatively meant you move to a new city, you let go of your faith community and you move somewhere else. How are we going to think seriously about what it means for somebody to be a diaspora member of your congregation, right? And how will they remain engaged in meaningful ways? And at the same time, be able to make a contribution to the communities they move to and to connect there as well. How might their movement create a new level of connection to a congregation elsewhere in the country? To see this as a plus, right? That we might connect with each other rather than remain in these isolated bubbles from each other. So if we begin to think about migration and mobility, not only in terms of crossing national boundaries, we're recognizing that there is significant fluidity of human mobility for a wide variety of reasons. Environmental crises will continue. We know that well in Northern California. We are seeing the impact of the impact of changing climates and the implications of that. Globally, that will be very significant. I'm originally, like I said, from Guatemala. What we are seeing right now in the mobility of people from Central America into the United States, into other places, is largely driven by this crisis that is being brought about by changes in climate. That will continue. Now, if we continue to view those as threats, like the way we're currently seeing the movement of folks to the border as a problem, as an issue, as something we cannot handle, that can overwhelm us. Honestly, if you step back and you think about the assets of the United States as a nation and the numbers of people that are coming to our border, this is a minute number of people. The crisis is because it's affecting individual lives. It's difficult, it's complicated for them. But as a nation, we actually have ample capacity to be able to accommodate and to respond to a situation like that if we think of it long term and think about what is the viability for us and the possibility for us, both as we are beginning to do to think about causes locally and regionally that are impacting people's mobility. So I think we have an opportunity to just think out ahead. In many other areas, science, when we look at medicine, when we look at business, when we look at economy, we step back. We look at systemic realities and we look at where crisis can become opportunities. I think we can do a very similar thing around migration. We have the opportunity to think really creatively about this and to be able to honestly look at people on the move, not just as threats and liabilities, but as also as contributors to the vibrancy and the resilience of communities. Historically, that's always actually been the case. It is true when people say the United States is a country of immigrants. It really actually is true. It does not mean that the United States has always been welcoming of immigrants. We have a very checkered history of exclusion, particularly around race. And so the wrestlings we are having as a nation now around race, around anti-Asian sentiment, anti-Black racism, all of those are blending into migration as well, because part of the fear is that these people will change our nation, will change our values, we change the way that we are. If you step back and you look at many of the immigrants that are coming to the United States, many of their core values are actually much more reflective of the values of the heartlands of America: hardworking, family-oriented, committed to faith and their traditions. Those are actually, that's part of the puzzling. I want to challenge even very progressive individuals. Democrats sit around going like, oh my God, what happened in Texas? Why aren't Hispanics voting with us? Well, in part is because of a recognition that we have tried to really limit our understanding of what are the core values of different groups of people, and to again just sort of portray people in very broad ways. People are complex. They have a variety of different interests. Economy matters to many. Many people migrate because of economic interest. If we don't address people's basic core needs and identity and only idealism, we're not going to be able to connect, and we're not going to be able to really see them as partners in transforming the world.
David Vásquez-Levy, thank you for being here tonight.
It's great to be with you both. Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a great conversation, and I appreciate the chance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like we are going to take your advice to heart. I have been taking your advice to heart every conversation I have with you, of using this moment to this pandemic moment, this pivot moment, this grand migratory moment to rethink how we do things. And I think evidence among that is a relationship between First Pres Dallas and First Pres Berkeley. So those of you who have been in groups already, discussion groups, This is Crucial discussion groups with one another, thank you. Thank you for getting ahead of the curve and trying to get to know your siblings in Christ a few states away. We're going to be launching some more joint groups this in the coming months. So stay tuned on that as we really do get in community and in relationship with our sister communities that prior to this, we never would have been in such close communication and such close relationship with one another. And so we thank you for your wisdom and the hope and the vision that you've provided us this evening.
Thank you, and have a great evening. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, friends.
Well, look forward to the next time.
See you all soon. Stay crucial.